There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
On the eastern edge of the city of Ipswich in Queensland lies a small suburb named Goodna. About 20 kilometres from the Brisbane central business district, Goodna is peppered with jacaranda, hoop pine and mango trees, and boasts numerous parks which are frequented by the public. It was the 26th of September, a spring day, at 1:42 p.m, when two police were stopped in their tracks. They had been searching the bushland on Redbank Plains Road after a young girl, 12-year-old Leanne Holland, had been reported missing by her family a few days before. The officers spotted a partly unclothed, shoeless body, one that would come to be identified as the blonde-haired, round-faced Leanne. What had happened to her and who was responsible? Police already had a suspect, one man. But, as we'd come to find out, there were a handful of problems. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with private investigator Graham Crowley, who co-authored the book Who Killed Leanne Holland, and has been reinvestigating the circumstances around Leanne's murder. It was the first day of school holidays, September the 23rd, 1991, when Leanne Holland left her home to go up to the shops. Can you tell us a little bit about who Leanne was, how old she was, and sort of how you'd describe her?
Leanne was 12 years old. She was the youngest of three children, lived with her father. Her mother had left the family basically when Leanne was about 1 year old. Dad worked, and Leanne pretty much had a free pass, really.
Was anyone else in the home when Leanne left to go up to the shops that day?
Yes, there was. Living in the house was Leanne, her older sister Melissa, Melissa's boyfriend Graham Stafford, and Terry Holland. Terry had gone to work, Melissa had gone to work, and Graham Stafford was on a RDO. And as I've said many times, if he did not have an RDO that day, we would not be having this conversation.
Did the family like Graham? Did he get along with them?
Sure, yeah, there was no problems. Melissa and Graham Stafford had been going out for about 9 months. There was apparently no conflict between him and Terry Holland, and no conflict between him and Leanne.
And Leanne didn't come home that night. Were the family worried by that point, or was that sort of common for a young girl to, stay at a friend's house and maybe they wouldn't see her for a day or so?
Maybe not common for other 12-year-olds, but it was common for Leanne. She used to stay with friends from time to time, and she had a friend who was living down the Goodna caravan park. She used to spend quite a bit of time down there, and the friend used to spend quite a bit of time at Leanne's place. And there was conversation during the day. In fact, Leanne's friend rang the house and Graham Stafford answered the phone, and the friend told Graham that she was looking for her. So Graham assumed, and that became sort of a bit of a problem later, he assumed she'd gone down to the caravan park to look for her friend, and then when Terry came home and Melissa came home, he said, oh, well, the friend rang, and so I assumed she'd gone down there. Now, because she had stayed away before, there was no drama that night. Plus, Terry lived downstairs and the main household was upstairs. Sometimes Leanne slept upstairs and sometimes she slept downstairs with her father. So there was maybe she's downstairs, maybe she's upstairs sort of thing going on.
Which can absolutely happen in, busy families when people are up at different times for work or school holidays. What led to the family eventually reporting her missing?
Well, Tuesday morning, Melissa and Graham got up and went for work. They thought that she was downstairs with Terry or with the friend at the caravan park. Terry got up for work and was of the same opinion. They all went to work. Tuesday afternoon, Graham and Melissa came home, as did Terry, and no one had heard or spoken to Leanne. They drove down to the caravan park looking for her, spoke to a friend. She hadn't seen her. They contacted other friends. They hadn't seen her. No one had seen her or spoken to her, so then they went and reported her to the police. All three of them went to Goodna Police in Graham Stafford's car to report her missing to the police. Now, that becomes relevant because on the police case, she was actually in the boot at that point.
There had been other girls go missing in the years prior, hadn't there? Did police initially suspect that there was any connection?
Well, I wasn't in the police at that point, and so I don't know the exact goings on, but there had been a number of missing women in the western suburbs in the years leading up to this, and they were under pressure to jump on.
3 days later, Leanne Holland's body was found. What was the cause of death?
So she was last seen on the Monday. She was reported missing Tuesday night. Thursday afternoon, her body was found and she'd been severely beaten around the skull, and the cause of death was skull fractures.
Circumstantial evidence was compiled that sort of led police to a prime suspect. Who was that prime suspect?
Graham Stafford. He became prime suspect, in fact, the only suspect, the Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock.
And why was that? Why were they so quick to jump on Graham? I mean, he's obviously the man in the house that isn't a family relative. He knew her. But why did they have this funnel vision when it came to him?
Well, that's a question I've asked myself for many years and never received a satisfactory answer.
By that Wednesday, when they started to suspect him, did they have any early evidence that tied him to her disappearance?
No. And by the time of his arrest, they had very little evidence as well.
So there ended up being, for example, a chair that had been removed from his boot. What did they think that meant?
There was a fold-up chair that he used to leave in the boot for when Melissa played netball or volleyball, I can't remember which. And so he used to go along and watch the game and take the chair out. And on his evidence, he cleaned the car up on the Monday and he took the chair out because it was rattling around in the boot and she had finished playing volleyball or netball for the season, so he removed it. On the Crown case, he took it out so he could put the body in there. But if you saw the photos of the boot, he would have had to have taken out a lot more stuff as well. He had a very full boot.
And you can see why police might start looking at him, because is it right to say that in the case of a murder such as this one, that the perpetrator is often known to the victim more often than not?
That's right, yes. And that's probably the reason they started looking at him. He was on a day off. On their case, he was the last one to see her. On the defence case, there was a lot of people who'd seen her after she was last allegedly seen. But yes, so she's supposedly last seen on the Monday and he was on the day off, and they couldn't find anyone who had seen her after about 10:30am.
Can you tell us a little bit about who else had seen her that day? Do we know if she ever got to the shops?
The police case is that the last confirmed sighting was at 10:30am, walking back from the shops toward her house. At 11 o'clock, a relative, an elderly relative of Leanne's, withdrew $200 from his bank account at the Commonwealth Bank, which is where the shops were that Leanne was going to. Now, the bank teller came forward 2 days later and said that at 11am on that Monday, there was a withdrawal from a bank account held by an elderly relative of Leanne Holland, and that it was by a young female who she believed to be Leanne Holland. And in support of that, she produced the withdrawal slip, as they had in those days, and it had her initials on it and it also had a big circular C on it, which she said confirmed that she had checked the signature against the passbook because it was what was called a third-party transaction. In other words, the owner of the passbook was not the person who had made the withdrawal, and that's why she put the big C on it. She'd confirmed it. So on the Crown case, he's saying that the elderly man is saying he withdrew the money, and this witness is saying, no, it wasn't the elderly man who withdrew the money. It was a young girl who I believe to be Leanne Holland. So the Crown case was at 10:30am was the last confirmed sighting. At 3pm, there was a man who worked across the road from where Leanne Holland lived at a hotel straight across the road. And he had known the Holland family for 15 years. And he had known Leanne ever since she was born. He told police that at 3pm, he saw her walk past and he had no doubt that it was Leanne Holland. The police dismissed that. They refused to accept it.
Why do you think they refused to accept it?
They said he'd been drinking and that he was unreliable.
Now, there was other evidence that was collected that was used in a courtroom to incriminate Graham. Can you talk us through a few of those examples and what they allegedly proved?
The evidence against Graham Stafford was purely circumstantial. He made no admissions, there were no direct witnesses, and there was no evidence that was found, for instance, DNA or anything like that, that was proved directly link him with the case, except for one that I'll talk about shortly. So there was a suggestion that Leanne had dyed her hair on that Monday because she had rung her sister and said, oh, I want to dye my hair and Graham will help me. And Melissa said, no, don't do it. I'll buy the dye when I get home and we can do it then. So when Leanne's body was found, her hair looked as though it had been dyed. It was very rich red, auburny colour, and she had blonde hair. So the police assumed at that point that he's helped her dye the hair. When the hair was sent to a chemist, he analysed it and found that, in fact, the hair hadn't been dyed, it was just blood, and there was no dye in the hair. So even though before the trial they were able to eliminate the suggestion that the hair had been dyed, that evidence found its way into the trial, the jury heard it, and it also found its way to the appeal court. The appeal court judges were talking about it when, in fact, the hair had never been dyed. Now, police found, not that day, but they took specimens and then later found that there was blood in the boot of Graham Stafford's car that was Leanne Holland's. And that was very, very incriminating. I'd go so far as say that the blood in the boot was enough to convict him by itself without anything else. But when you look at it, when you analyse it, it's not quite as simple as that. She was bashed to the head. There was a lot of skull fractures. Now, the head bleeds very, very freely. So there would have been a lot of blood from those wounds. It was a Crown case that he'd picked up the body in the house, that the murder occurred in the house where they lived, and that he carried her down the front stairs and put her in the boot of his car. Now, what they found was that there was a drop of blood on a rag in the boot of his car. There was a drop of blood on a tool bag in the boot of the car, and a drop of blood on a blanket in the boot of the car. Now, the tool bag was his. The blanket was owned by Melissa Holland, and the rag was not identified as where it came from. So, yes, there was blood in the boot of his car that belonged to Leanne Holland, but we're talking a very, very minuscule amount of blood on two items that did not belong to him, or possibly did not belong to him, and one that did. Now, with the amount of blood that would come from a head wound, it could be argued that the amount of blood that would have been found in the house and in the car to be significantly more than what was found.
How did Graham's defence respond to that? Could it have been a cut of a finger from 6 months prior? Are there other explanations?
Some weeks before the murder, Leanne cut her foot in the house and she walked downstairs to show her father. And it was the defence case that any blood in the house, and there was only minimal blood in the house, we're talking 2 or 3 drops of blood in the bathroom, which may have been Leanne's blood, by the way, or may have been Melissa's blood, or may have been the brother's blood. They could determine that it was Holland blood, but they couldn't go any further than that. So there was a minuscule amount of blood in the house. There was some minuscule amount of blood on the front stairs. And then, of course, there's the suggestion that if that blanket that belonged to Melissa was somewhere other than in the boot of the car at that time, well, that could explain how it got on there, or in fact, if the tool bag was out of the boot of the car. So it was not conclusive.
What did they think the murder weapon was? Did they allege what he had used to commit such a violent act?
They took possession of a hammer owned by Graham Stafford that was in his toolbox in the boot of the car. And they used what's called a presumptive test, a field test. And the presumptive test showed blood on the hammer. In fact, presumptive test showed blood throughout the house, throughout the car, on the soles of every pair of shoes in the house, and a whole lot of other places. There was a bucket on the back stairs that was half full of water. A presumptive test showed that there was blood in the water and on the mop. Now, all that evidence went to the jury that there was all these presumptive tests. They showed a video where the scientific police were swabbing Graham Stafford's car. Oh, look at this, blood on the boot, blood on the door, blood on the steering wheel, blood on the gear stick. But these presumptive tests also react to other things like materials and chemicals in the atmosphere. So they took these presumptive tests, but later on, when they actually tested them in the laboratory, none of these things turned out to be blood. But all that went to the jury.
And how about a hair? Because there was also evidence that potentially a hair of Leanne's had been found in his car.
A hair was found on a sponge in the boot of his car, but it couldn't be determined that it was her hair or it wasn't her hair. It was just a hair. They couldn't say whose hair it was. But the Crown case was it was her hair.
And the Crown case, what did they think that Graham's motive would be for committing this crime?
They didn't give a motive per se, but they innuendoed that he helped her dye her hair in the shower and the bathroom and things got carried away and she was going to dob him in for touching her or whatever and it got out of hand.
Had he had any history of violence or a criminal record or any suggestion he would be capable of this sort of thing?
He had no criminal convictions before the murder, hadn't had any arrests or anything actually. Apparently he'd had a couple of speeding tickets, but that was it. No interaction with police, no complaints, no investigations or anything. This was the first offence. And we've talked about that because here's a guy who's absolutely clean skinned, no history, no complaints, no innuendo, no suggestion, no suspicion. He is convicted of this murder. He does 15 years imprisonment. He's now been out of prison for 15 years. And since his release, he's had no convictions since then and no investigations, no charges. He's been in full-time employment since then. He's bought a house, he's bought a car, and he's in a long-term steady relationship with a woman. And I say Queensland Corrective Services should hold him up as a pin-up boy because this shows that the system works. And here we have a deranged, vicious killer, and they've managed to reform him and put him on the straight and narrow, and he's never reoffended, or he was never guilty in the first place.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with private investigator Graham Crowley about his book, Who Killed Leanne Holland? Do you know much about what his disposition was like when he was accused, when he was in the courtroom? Has he always protested his innocence?
110%. He made no admissions to the police. He denied any involvement in the murder from day one. That has been his go-to position for the last 30 years. He's been out of prison since 2006, and in that time he has continued to maintain and protest his innocence. He has applied for a judicial review. He's applied for a coronial inquest. He is continually asking the Queensland government to review the case because he says he was wrongly convicted. He actually served a life sentence, so he could literally walk away and say, look, guys, I've done my time, leave me alone, I just want to live my life. He could actually do that, but he has continued to protest his innocence and try and get an inquest into this case. The situation, Jesse, is that in any violent crime in Queensland, an inquest must be held. Must be, it's law, has to be. There is an out that if someone is arrested in relation to it, then the government can say, well, someone's been arrested, we don't have to hold an inquest. There is that sort of out. But in this case, his conviction was quashed in 2009. So no one has been convicted of her murder. So he's been demanding an inquest be held, as have others. There's been other people who have become aware of the case and they've demanded an inquest be held. It's the Queensland State Government's position that they don't want to hold an inquest. Not necessary.
Why was his conviction quashed?
His defence continued to protest his innocence after his conviction. So they kept putting in appeals, and as a result of an appeal to the governor in 2006, it went back to the appeal court, and the appeal court in 2009 quashed the conviction.
Did criminal profilers, and this is sort of earlier on, and I know you explore this in the book and the podcast, did criminal profilers have a sense of what sort of offender would be responsible for a crime of this magnitude, and did that ever fit with Graham?
Actually, there's been 2 profiles done of the killer in this case. We asked an American profiler to do a profile back in around 1995. And at that time, profiling was unheard of, basically. It was a very, very new science. Today, it's accepted as, mainstream, and they do a profile pretty much on every case. But back then, it was developing science and it was really, really new. So we asked a profiler back then to do a profile, and that profile did not fit Graham Stafford. We asked another profiler in 2019 to do a profile, and that profile did not fit Graham Stafford, because what happened was in 2019 I decided to do a podcast on the case, and as part of that podcast I engaged a criminal profiler to do a profile for me.
And so does it look like this might be more consistent with someone who has potentially committed violent crime before, who could potentially be a serial offender?
Yes.
Do you think that this is related to the women who disappeared previously?
No, but 3 weeks, almost to the day, 3 weeks after the murder of Leanne Holland, another 12-year-old girl was murdered in Goodna, 1 kilometre from where Leanne Holland lived. And I've always believed those 2 murders are connected.
Do we have any idea who was responsible for that second murder?
Yes, he was arrested the same day as the second murder occurred, and he's still serving a life sentence. He has severe mental health issues and he's still in custody, and I suspect he probably will never be released. So I suspected that he was possibly involved in the murder of Leanne Holland. The police position was that the murders weren't connected, and Leanne was bashed to death and the second girl was drowned. And so therefore they argued, well, look at this, no similarities in the modus operandi, so therefore they're not connected, which is just rubbish. And coincidentally, the profile of the killer of Leanne that I obtained in 2019 actually fits that guy.
Looking back on the investigation as you have done, and since, as Graham has also done and spoken out about, what were some crucial errors that you've identified during that investigation?
I identified 50 errors with that case. Probably the most significant one was the time of death. The Crown case was that he had to have murdered Leanne between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. on the Monday, and that if he didn't, then he didn't do it. That was one of the first problems I found with the case initially when I started looking at it in 1992, was that the time of death was out. And when I asked a forensic entomologist to review the evidence, she came back and said that the time of death was actually on the Tuesday, not the Monday.
Oh, wow. Was that ever shown to a jury, or was that only afterwards that came to light?
I didn't get involved until after Graham Stafford's conviction, so the jury didn't know about that.
How could they have gotten the time of death so wrong?
Time of death, Jessie, in these matters is very difficult to determine. She had been dead for at least 2 days, maybe 3 days, and pinning that down to a particular time is extremely difficult. So what they had to do was use a forensic entomologist, and the entomologist looked at the growth rates of the maggots that were on the body, because the maggots grow through different stages. And from that, you can work backwards to find out when the maggots were laid. And from that, you can then calculate an approximate time of death. Now, this is where it gets complicated. The growth rates of the maggots is dependent on the ambient air temperature. The hotter it is, the quicker they grow. The colder it is, the slower they grow. The police obtained the wrong temperature from the Bureau of Meteorology, and therefore the calculations of the growth rates were wrong. And after I found the correct temperatures and gave them to the same entomologist that the police used, she then recalculated the growth rates and came back with Tuesday.
And can you tell us about the maggot that was found in Graham's car and what role that played?
So on the Wednesday, now, if you remember, she was reported missing on the Tuesday night. On the Wednesday, the police started a massive investigation into her disappearance. And early Wednesday morning, they seized Graham Stafford's car. And when they opened it, the forensic officer, the scientific officer, said that he saw a maggot in the boot, but he didn't take possession of it. So he said he closed the boot again and he took possession of the car, and when he was going to examine the car at a later time, he would look again for the maggot. And on the Thursday, he searched the car again, and lo and behold, he found the maggot and took possession of it. Now, 3 scientists that we engaged to review that evidence just promptly said it was rubbish. Didn't happen, couldn't happen. Firstly, a maggot would not be alive after that period of time without any food. And secondly, you'd be unlikely to find it. So the scientific officer finds a maggot in the boot of the car on the Wednesday, and then on the Thursday he finds it again and takes possession of it and puts it into a vial. Now, this is before Leanne Holland's body was found. And then later in the afternoon, when the body's found, he goes there and the doctor takes some maggots off the body and puts them into vials, which she then hands to the same scientific officer. So now we have 3 vials. We have a vial with a maggot in it that was found at midday, which has the number 3 on it. And then at 4 p.m, the pathologist takes some maggots off the body at the crime scene and puts them into vials, which he then numbers 1 and 2. I was running around saying, this maggot's collected 4 hours before the others. Why is it number 3? So then I started looking for, let's prove that it actually ever existed. Where's the photographs of the maggot in the boot? Oh, there's none. Where's the videotape of the maggot in the boot? Oh, there's none. Where's your written notes to show that you took possession of the maggot in the boot? There's none. But you do have notes of the stuff you took out of the boot. Yes, here's all the notes of all the stuff that come out of the boot. Show me where you got the maggot. There's none.
Finally, I wanted to ask, where is the investigation at now? And do you think that there will be a coronial inquest eventually into this?
Well, all coronial inquests have been refused. After 2009, after his conviction was quashed, there was a groundswell of concern in Queensland, Jesse. The media were all over this story because it had been bubbling along for years and years and years, and there was these allegations and claims that maybe Stafford wasn't the killer. So the media was hardly a week went by when there wasn't a story about it. So eventually the police commissioner agreed to a review of the case. Not a reinvestigation. He didn't agree to reinvestigate it. He just said that he would have police review the evidence. So in 2012, Queensland Police started a review of their original investigation, which took them some 18 months or something. And at the end of that, they refused to release the findings, but someone within the police leaked it to the media that they were satisfied with their original investigation and that Graham Stafford was the killer without releasing the report. So in 2014, eventually, again after much pressure, they held a press conference and they said that they'd done a comprehensive review of the original investigation and they were satisfied that Graham Stafford was the killer and that was the end of the story. But they weren't going to release the review. So come 2014, at this stage, Graham Stafford's solicitors then started applying through the courts to have the police review released to them so they could find out exactly what the police did or didn't do in the review. And the police strenuously and vigorously fought the release of that review. In 2017, the review was leaked to Channel 7, and Channel 7 did a story on the case called Murder Uncovered, wherein it shows quite comprehensively that Graham Stafford was the killer. His solicitors have continued to seek the release of the review, even though it was leaked to Channel 7, but the Queensland Police have continued to object and fight the release of that review up until 2020, when we brought out the podcast in relation to it. And of course, in the podcast, we made a big point of saying, for 6 years now, the Queensland Police have consistently refused to release that report. It's okay to leak it to a news media, it's okay to leak it to Channel 7, but it's not okay to give it to Graham Stafford's solicitors. So after that, we've now got a redacted copy of the police review, and that's going to be the subject of another episode on the podcast. So the police review is like 520 pages, and the copy we've got is about 380, so about 130 is redacted. But it's going to be the subject of another episode that we're going to do later this month.
Fascinating. Do you think that with all the work that you're doing and that Graham has done, do you see justice for him one day?
Good question, Jessie. For a long time, I always believed that the truth of this sad, sorry mess would come out in my lifetime, but I'm beginning to think it won't be in my lifetime now.
Graham Crowley is a former detective turned private investigator who's spent over 20 years investigating the conviction of Graham Stafford for the brutal murder of Leanne Holland in 1991. While he was initially employed by the Stafford family, Graham Crowley has continued to pursue the case at his own expense. You can find a link to his book, Who Killed Leanne Holland, in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you want more true crime or want to connect with other true crime fans, then please join our Facebook group, True Crime Conversations. And if you've been enjoying our recent episodes, then please let us know. Leave us a review on your favourite podcast app. And for more from me, you can listen to Mamma Mia Out Loud 3 times a week. It's the podcast with what women are talking about.